Peter, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
They're in a world of pain, India, aren't they?
Well, yeah, there looks like there's sort of uncontrolled and quite widespread spread of COVID there. You got to remember there's over 1 billion people, so 300,000 as a percentage, isn't as big as what it might sound, but it's still pretty big. And in a country like that, a lower middle income country, there's probably 3 times as many that you're not finding because, people can't afford tests or can't get to tests, etc. So, yes, there's a lot there. And you can see that with the number of people presenting to hospitals and the number of deaths. So it's a real problem.
And I'm hearing that there aren't even testing facilities in rural areas entirely, none at all. So this is obviously going to have an impact on the rest of the world because people travel to Australia, they travel to other countries to come to Australia as well. What impact has it had on our COVID positive numbers returning in hotel quarantine?
Well, my understanding is that a lot of the positive people, or a lot of the people coming back from India in particular, are an increasing amount of the total number that are positive that we're seeing in Australia. But we also got to put this in perspective. I mean, a few months ago, it was the US, North America, Europe that had, high numbers, maybe just as high as a percentage of the population. And there's still a lot of people not being able to get tests because their positivity rate is still quite high compared to ours. Ours is about 0.1%. And a lot of those countries is 2 or 3%, which sounds good. But to my mind, that still means you're missing a lot of cases. But this is going to be an ongoing problem we're going to have for probably a few years. Large amounts of this infection spreading, more so in countries' winters than in summers, but it can occur at any time. And that's the risk for people coming back to Australia and why, for a while yet, we're going to need restrictions on people where they travel, but also some type of quarantining when you come back from any areas where there may be COVID transmitting in the community, which is nearly all countries in the world.
We discussed a couple of months ago, Peter, the new system that supposedly got into place, which is those travelling from other countries into Australia, before they depart, they had to show evidence that they'd had a negative COVID test. Now, I just want to play you something from the Prime Minister this afternoon that indicates that that may not be operating at all. Have a listen.
We're putting this in place now, that if someone has been in India in the past fortnight, right, and if they're coming through a transit country, then they will have to have a PCR test in that country 72 hours before departure.
So maybe this system hasn't been in place, or has it not been in place for those coming from other countries? I'm not so sure now.
Yeah, well, I thought it was in place for most people. I mean, the problem with these tests, you can't always get them, and in some countries you can get fraudulent probably results as well. And the other thing to note, just because you got a negative test tomorrow doesn't mean you can't still develop it 3 days later or 10 days later. That's the whole point of the 14-day quarantine. But by the same token, this may be what was maybe a loophole. You got onto the plane in somewhere and you had a negative test, but then you transit, say, in Singapore for a few days, and maybe some places that have got low transmission rates, we haven't had to have those tests. So I actually thought it was in place anyway. This sounds like they're, going to make it a bit more rigorous. But in any case, just because people have a negative test, you can't presume they're not going to develop infection in the 14 days after they get back to Australia because of the incubation period. So it decreases our risk if people who've got COVID aren't travelling, and that's better for them as well. You're better off, not being in a plane for 24 hours, for instance, if you've got COVID. But there are issues, what if one member of the family out of 6 have got it? What do you do then? All those practical things. At the end of the day, there's this problem about what we do with high prevalence places like India at the moment, but it's been other places before. We've still got an obligation, in my view, if you're an Australian resident or an Australian citizen, that you are allowed in some way to come back in the country, because otherwise we could say, hey, nobody can come here for 2 years if you're in India. And that's quite a problem if you're there. Now, that's a different issue if you're going over there for business that can be put off or you're not an Australian resident. But we need to have a balance between being reasonable for Australian citizens and residents coming back to Australia and taking precautions such as quarantine or testing, etc., and vaccination, but not having a blanket rule that they can't come back at all.
Yeah, like you, I was a bit miffed yesterday when they said, we'll cut this by a third, the number of Indians who can come into Australia, given the fact that we had this very virulent strain coming from the UK, and there was no change to those numbers coming from that part of the world. I wonder whether we're becoming a little bit more risk averse, and maybe we're not far away from saying to people in the world, well, Your country is drenched with COVID-19. I'm sorry, if you haven't had the jab, there's no flight.
Well, I think at some stage we'll probably be a bit more vigorous about the vaccine, but you've got to remember at the moment there's a real shortage worldwide of the vaccine. So, having that as a rule makes it difficult for a lot of people who may not be able to access it. And so, again, it's a balancing act. We need the risks here as low as we can make them. And by having pre-test testing, by having vaccination as much as possible for people before they get here, and still keeping people in quarantine of some description for 14 days after they get here, that all decreases the risk, but it doesn't make the risk zero. So we still have to keep on taking all the precautions we are. Really, I think being careful this winter with, how big crowds we allowed inside and all that. We run the risk of becoming a bit too complacent, I think, because it's be another year, or at least till the end of the year, and we get a lot of the at-risk people vaccinated, and and things get under better control in other countries. We're still at quite a risk of getting a leak and it's spreading in the community. Less than a year ago, but the risk is still there, and we need to do everything we can to decrease that risk, but we'll never make it zero.